Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Since October 7th of 2023, the Israeli Defense Forces have engaged in a targeted and meticulous military campaign against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, a densely populated urban battlefield in which militants have embedded themselves deep within the civilian infrastructure across the metropolis. How has the IDF fared compared to other Western militaries? What special circumstances make this war unique? And from an ethical point of view, how does the IDF rank? Joining us to discuss all of this is Mr. John Spencer, a leading expert on urban warfare who has made several trips to observe the IDF in action since October 7th. Mr. Spencer, a former infantry soldier and commander, has served in the U.S. Army for 25 years, and he is currently the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at West Point. He's published 3 books and countless articles and book chapters, and throughout his career he has advised senior U.S. Army leaders, including 4-star generals. Mr. Spencer will speak for 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session from the audience. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Mr. John Spencer. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So it's hard to go back in time, but I think it's necessary to have a discussion on the war in Gaza, Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, however the framework you want to use, which started on October 7th from an analytical perspective of the war. On October 7th, roughly 3,000 Hamas militants, Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists, and Gazan civilians invaded southern Israel and killed over 1,200 Israelis, kidnapped over 250 from multiple nationalities, and then murdered, raped, burned, killed civilians. Lots of details on that day and the scale of it, the number of penetrations on Israel's border wall with Gaza. But from an analytical perspective of the war, it began the war, and on October 8th, Israel declared war, a war of self-defense against Hamas in Gaza. Hamas being the political apparatus with a military wing and a military of Gaza, a self-governed area of terrain, which really plays into effect of analysis of the war and what were the challenges, the actions of the IDF against Hamas in the war. Once Hamas and those who joined Hamas withdrew into Gaza with the 250 plus hostages, it became one of the greatest military challenges of the modern era, where it's very hard, if not inappropriate, to compare it to anything else just on the variables that I will discuss on the context of the war. So in the war, Israel's war against Hamas, with 3 stated goals: return the illegally taken hostages, destroy Hamas's military capabilities, remove Hamas as the governing authority of Gaza, and secure Israel's borders and prevent Hamas or any other group from Gaza from being able to do another attack against Israel and into Israel territory. The actual technical, or I would say contextual information, is very important to be able to do comparisons. So within Gaza, on the opening moments of October 7th, there were also 4,000 rockets in the opening hours launched from Gaza towards Israeli civilian sites, all of them being inaccurate, as in not able to actually determine where they're going. But there were thousands of more rockets. So you had rockets emanating out of enemy territory at this point. You had the 250 plus hostages. Gaza is a very dense piece of terrain. 200 is 25 miles long, 5 to 7 miles wide, with 24 cities, 10 cities of over 100,000, Gaza City over 600,000, highly dense portions of Gaza, highly dense populated areas. But from a military context, and why it's really hard to compare in the history of urban warfare, is that Hamas, the governing authority of Gaza since 2005, also spent over $1 billion just in their tunnel complex range of over 350 miles. Some estimates are higher of military only purposed tunnels underneath the urban areas of Gaza, ranging from just underneath buildings to over 200 feet underground. It was not just that investment, but every aspect of the environment of Gaza was prepared by Hamas for war for over 20 years, basically since they seized power in 2007. But before then as well, even during Israel's occupation of Gaza, Hamas was building tunnels and preparing. From a military analysis, that's something very unique and really hard to compare in history is when the enemy is in the urban terrain and has prepared it for defense. Matter of fact, most of the urban battles of history are where the defender has had little amount of time. And the more amount of time that they've had to prepare to defense, the greater the battle, the more protracted, the more destructive it is. And many of the biggest battles of urban warfare history, like Stalingrad or Ortona or others, were essentially meeting engagements where two militaries met in the urban terrain, unique to, let's say, where somebody might say the 21st century, which is really trying to dramatize the history of war. Even in the past 20 years, some of the biggest battles were because of that nature of the defender having time to prepare. The biggest battle for the U.S. military in the entire Iraq War was the Second Battle of Fallujah over this small city of 300,000, but where the enemy was given about 6 months to prepare for the battle that would ensue. The biggest battle since World War II, before the invasion of the Ukraine war, was the Battle of Mosul, which was a 9-month battle to take back the city from ISIS, 3 to 5,000 ISIS fighters. And the reason it was the biggest battle since World War II, with over 100,000 Iraqi security forces used to take the city back, is because ISIS had 2 years and prepared it for defense. So when you extrapolate that out to the conditions of the cities of Gaza, especially those bigger ones like Gaza City, you have 20 years of preparation where you have every step you take, there's a tunnel underneath you. Every house essentially has been militarized, or most houses where they have caches or house-borne IEDs or sniper positions. The amount of preparation can't be discounted when trying to compare this to other situations. Also, the enemy's context really matters. So not just what Hamas did on October 7th, but how does it fight? How does it prepare for defending urban terrain and fighting the IDF, and what strategies does it use? Hamas's strategy is not to fight the IDF, but to cause what is historical in Israel's wars for the international community to halt Israel before achieving a victory, even after the horrific crimes of October 7th. So Hamas historically even has been used an example that I teach in classes of using a human shield strategy, where it violates the laws of war and uses protected populations like civilians and protected sites, hospitals, schools, mosques, UN buildings, and uses them for military purposes, trying to use the protections afforded to those buildings or populations so that the attacker cannot attack them and must use other methods, and complicates the operations. It's a violation of war, but it's called human shield strategy, where you're putting something in front of you so the enemy can't attack you. Hamas did that and prepared basically every hospital, every school, and and used it for military purposes in some way. But Hamas also uses a human sacrifice strategy. Unlike, again, comparing this to even 20th century or World War II, World War One, where Hamas both states and acts that it needs its civilians to die, will put its civilians in harm's way, will not allow civilians into protective tunnels that they use. That's human sacrifice strategy, into where Hamas leaders will say, I need the death of my population, which is a very unique aspect. To get to the conduct of, so that's all the variables on from day one, from October 7th, rockets coming in. And if anybody's ever been to Israel and Gaza, the proximity, rockets coming into Israel, hostages every second counting, the preparation of the environment from the enemy strategy, its political strategy, which is to use international pressure to force Israel to stop before achieving its goals, to create these ideals. This is also a war being fought, unlike other wars of the past, in the global eye of algorithm driven social media, which really changes things. Even if I take you to battles of modern history, if you're talking the 2017 Battle of Mawari, 2016 Battle of Mosul, 2000, Raqqa, Aleppo, the battles of Fallujah, Ramadi, others, where you have media coverage, but this is the first war of this scale and intensity where you have cell phone driven, social media driven, algorithm driven condemnation or footage, and then all different experts, which really gets to, all war is a contest of will. So when this war started, it was, Hamas's will to believe that it could achieve its goal of conducting the October 7th attack and maintaining power and surviving as a political and military organization of the war. The contest of wills is fought both locally, of course, between Israel and Hamas, and Israel's population in a democratic society against Hamas and its population of being basically governed ruthlessly. But the influence through social media of the population of the world, where we've seen, to include people that we would consider experts, try to convince people on top of the social media driven algorithm footage, photos, reports, studies that Israel was from day one conducting some type of illegal operation. And this is where we get into basically the metrics. So the conditions that Israel had, the capabilities that Israel had to enter Gaza, to retrieve its hostages, to remove Hamas's military capabilities, vast military capabilities. Hamas on October 6th was a political organization with a military of roughly 30, if not up to 50,000 militants spread across the Gaza Strip in 24 organized battalions with brigade leaders, battalion company with 20,000 rocket supplies, each battalion owning defensive terrain, a vast capability. The actual condemnation, though, when Israel had to enter that terrain, like historical examples, which would be a very destructive war based on just the nature of the complexity of dense urban warfare, when the defender can't be convinced to surrender or flee or other examples, we've seen in this war people try to use the numbers to justify their opinions about the war in what's called effects-based condemnation. So the law of war, and I saw it from day one on analyzing this war, and I have now been to Gaza with observing the IDF operations across the spectrum of their operations, from interviewing the prime minister, the chief of the IDF, all brigade commanders, battalion commanders, IDF soldiers in the field, assessing their performance, their capabilities, their actions in the war. No matter what I tell people on that, it absolutely is a moral, ethical, disciplined force achieving unique things in the most complex urban scenario that any military has faced in modern history, if not history, given, of course, wars are fought under the context of the times in which they're fought. That is also the laws of war, the geopolitical aspects, all of those elements. A challenge nobody has faced, and still achieving incredible means in their pursuit of just execution of the war. Everybody agrees that they had a just reason to defend themselves. Well, most do. But we've become in this world where we believe that the numbers justify without an access to information. And this is where the law of war, especially things like proportionality, require any military to assess the military advantage, the concrete military advantage of their operations against the potential collateral damage, and then take all reasonable and feasible measures to limit that damage. That's called precaution. Since in this war, we've seen everybody who has an opinion, who really hasn't done research, try to use numbers to say, I don't care what the law says, I don't care what the IDF have done. This number means that they're intentionally causing civilian harm and intentionally destroying civilian infrastructure. When that's not true and that's not the way the law of war works, this is where I've said statements like Israel has done more and implemented more measures to prevent civilian harms than any military in the history of urban warfare, which is very controversial, but factual because of the fact of when Israel entered Gaza, what are the known ways to limit civilian harms, both on strike policies, evacuating cities, limiting the use of force, handing out your maps to communicate with the civilians, all of these measures that maybe we'll talk about in questions. This effects-based condemnation or trying to convince the world what the laws of war say, how they're different in different contexts of rules of engagement, has been really problematic in providing technical analysis of Israel's performance in Gaza.
All right. Well, thank you for your insights, John. On that note, regarding the effects-based condemnation here, one question that is often brought up, as you mentioned, typically by adversaries of Israel, is the question of civilian to combatant ratios in these operations. Now, you have served in combat tours in Iraq. How does the conduct and the civ-cash ratio of the IDF's operation vary from those of American operations in, say, Iraq or Afghanistan?
So I play these numbers, or I don't play the numbers. I provide the numbers from a case study perspective. So yes, I can give you case studies of U.S.-backed operations and the operations of Mosul, where, again, the problem is in the numbers. And this measure of what is your civilian to combatant ratio isn't how the laws of war or even analysis of individual military operations is done, but it became something that the media and advocates used to try to portray some type of illegality, intention, actions, that the number was higher. And no, it wasn't. One, the numbers are not true. Especially from day one, the world started taking the numbers provided by the designated terrorist organization by 20 different countries, Hamas. The Gaza Health Ministry started putting out numbers of this is our estimate of civilians, and they do not distinguish between civilians and combatants or non-combatants and combatants. And most people need a class on what is a non-combatant in war. That is somebody who is a protected person who is not partaking in the hostilities in any way. And then what is the combatant? It is definitely a member of Hamas's military wing, whether no matter what they're doing, but also anybody who's partaking in the hostilities. Yes, in certain parts of the war, if you compare to any like scenario, although I just went through a very long detail of there is no like scenario, Israel's civilian to combatant ratio is still historically low given any comparable context, whether it's high intensity operations in the Battle of Mosul, Fallujah, Raqqa, Aleppo, Mawari, Manila, all of these. But it's really essential that people understand that these are just forms of lies, damn lies, and statistics. These are people taking a number without context and saying, look, this proves it. Look, how many combatants has the Gaza Health Ministry ever declared were killed? Zero. How many? It took Israel about 6 months to come up with a number, and that is very hard to do. I can tell you as an urban warfare researcher, there's never been a war or battle, because there's a big difference, where anybody could tell you daily, down to the single digit, how many civilians or combatants were dying. That is so ridiculous that somebody believed that Hamas, the Gaza Health Ministry, could tell you every day, and the way, and not ask the question, well, how did they develop that number? Is it from bodies coming into hospitals that started that way? Is it self-reported missing personnel? Is it this? Is it the numbers have been very analyzed, but I don't like because it falls into that effects-based condemnation. Yes, if we took the numbers and compared it to any like scenario, it is historically low, but I don't want people, especially in the future of war, saying, look, I know you have the right to defend yourself, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio in this scenario? And that's not the way the law of war works, or war in general.
Right, thank you. Now, of course, the media likes to run with these inflated numbers provided by the Gaza Ministry of Health, or Hamas, really. But can you explain why international organizations like the UN or the ICC or the ICJ, who should be tasked with enforcing international humanitarian law, why is it that they are so reluctant to point out Hamas's lack of distinction between uniformed soldiers, combatants, non-combatants, their embedding of civilians with, or excuse me, combatants within civilian infrastructures? Why are they so silent on that?
It's a really great question. And I've asked this multiple times, just as an objective, and despite what people think, and I'm not Jewish, I'm not Israeli, I'm a war researcher, as an objective observer, but also watching wars beyond the Israel-Gaza or Israel-Hamas war, watching the Ukraine war, watching other wars throughout history, watching these politicized organizations decide on which side they're going to advocate for. You're right, the United Nations, a whole host of United Nations affiliated organizations do not condemn in at all, not even barely from October 7th, but especially in the execution of the war, Hamas's use of human shield strategy, weaponization of all the hospitals, schools, mosques, their own population, what they do to their own population. I can't tell you why. I can point to many of the reasons. From a really, there are some good intentioned human rights activists who have now authority and positions of some credibility. You have an anti-Israel cohort within that. You have an anti-Western cohort within that. You have an anti-war cohort. But this, especially within the United Nations, which is a political organization by its very nature and its history of thoughts, opinions, statements, votes towards Israel, is very problematic. But within the objective context of Hamas, to say things only on one side, it needs to be called out. I can't answer why. Like when you say hospitals are off limits, which is not a true statement in war, and I've been vocal on that. Absolutely, hospitals, their staff, the wounded, everybody, protected population. But for the enemy or anybody to use it for military purposes is the violation. And the violation is not moving forward and removing military personnel and military equipment and all this from protected sites. But all these organizations, not one call for Hamas to surrender, to unilaterally, unconditionally give up the hostages, stop violating the law of war in the way it's executing its side of the war. I can't answer why, but I can definitely say it is 100% a valid question.
All right, thank you. Now on that note, everyone seems, as you point out, to use casualty figures and proportionality measures to determine who is in the right and who is in the wrong. But how different would this war look if Israel didn't have the defensive capabilities that it has, like the Iron Dome or David Sling, etc.?
Yeah, that's also a very important question. I thought you were going to ask me how different would this look had it happen with a different nation like the United States, with different capabilities. You're right, the defensive capabilities of Israel, especially for the anti-rocket, Iron Dome, David Sling, other aspects, when you see that Hamas launched 13 to plus thousand rockets, had Israel not had those defensive capabilities in this war, tens of thousands of Israelis. But this also gets into what I call rocket diplomacy, that negates the violation. It's the same thing when the Islamic regime of Iran launched historic level of ballistic and cruise missiles against Israel, to then say, well, Israel is so strong and has invested so heavily in its defensive capabilities, it didn't harm anybody. No, no, this intention and action can't count for only one side. Intention and action, absolutely. All of those rockets that Hamas and others, Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others, which many of those landing inside of Gaza, killing Gazans and adding to the death ratios. Those rockets are not discriminate. They do not know where their exact target they're going. Every one of those 13,000 plus rockets are a violation of the law of war. But you're right. If Israel hadn't invested billions of dollars in its defense, those rockets would have killed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands. If you know the proximity of the ground that we're talking about, even from to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, from Tel Aviv, it would have caused tens of thousands of deaths for sure.
Thank you. Now, of course, you are not a Hamas commander or a Hamas official, but on the other side of that question, it seems like these tactics that Hamas uses of employing human shields and human sacrifices seem to be largely defensive. Now, what would the conflict look like if instead of these sort of improvised ragtag rockets and missiles and some of these low-level missiles from Iran, they had the same or similar capabilities as a modern military?
Great question. Also would look greatly different. All warfare is asymmetric. So there's no world where two peer enemies fight each other, in the open field using their match strengths. Like all warfare is asymmetric. And why we've seen an increase in urban warfare around the globe is because of weaker forces believing and knowing they can get an advantage to pull an advanced military into urban terrain. So and the goals matter, right? So Israel has fought many wars against Hamas in Gaza, but the goals of the wars, like stopping the rockets, is being the goal. Reducing Hamas's rocket capabilities has been the goals. But in a war where the goal is to remove the enemy military's capabilities, you can't do that strictly through bombing. You have to enter the enemy's territory and take those capabilities away. In the dense urban environment, we call it the great equalizer for a reason. There are nuances there, is that it will negate even the most powerful military of the world's capabilities. And if you prepared it for 20 years, it will definitely challenge the military no matter their capability. And in war, sometimes it isn't about killing the other. Again, war is a contest of will. Matter of fact, Sun Tzu said, the greatest form of war is to win without fighting. And this contest of wills within international politicians, everything, Hamas built this environment not to win, but to delay so that the international condemnation, as we saw, will build so greatly that it will constrain Israel. It will stop Israel or anybody else. There was a different way for Israel to do this operation, 100%. And historically, I would have said, in order to do this, and not just John Spencer, but generals like General Mark Milley, who was the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff for two presidents, said that absolutely the U.S. would have done this differently. We would have used more combat power to try to end it quicker, because that's what you want to do. Fighting protracted, block by block, house by house wars like we've seen is highly destructive and leads to what we've seen, the questioning of the goals, the questioning of the ability to achieve the goals, and now the criticism of the military, like you could have done it a different way. Absolutely. You could have done it with more force to make the enemy, in this case Hamas, believe that you don't have a chance of winning. And unfortunately, within the political context of this war, many nations have sent Hamas messages and the United Nations, just hold out. You can win, and we will stop Israel.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more here. Now, typically we are used to seeing Hamas fighters equipped with Kalashnikovs and AKs. More recently, we're seeing footage and images emerging of militants using American M16s and M4s. Do you know where they're sourcing these weapons from?
No, I've seen that. And actually, when I observed the equipment that dead Hamas and others left in Israel during the October 7th attack, it ranged from Russian, North Korean, Iranian. So the global arms sales and where the U.S. weapons are given, or like in Afghanistan left, that isn't indicative to me of something different than absolutely we should be questioning how Hamas built this vast arsenal of rockets, munitions, you name it, and how it got those in the so-called blockade that Israel and evidently Egypt has been imposing on Gaza. But that specific about U.S. weapons is not surprising on the global smuggling of weapons and where they come from.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We have unfortunately reached the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again, John, for taking the time to join us on such an interesting topic.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, for our viewers and listeners, is there somewhere that you could direct them if they'd like to follow more of your work?
Sure. I mean, most of my work, I just released a really important podcast on my Urban Warfare Project podcast that they can get anywhere they find their podcast about this topic of legitimacy, laws of war, rules of engagement. That's a really great source. And then johnspenceronline.com is where I hang most of my publications that I produce.
All right, very good. Now, for those of you watching in the future on YouTube, I will be sure to link those in the video description below. If you don't already, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also follow the Middle East Forum podcast on Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, and most platforms where you follow podcasts. As always, we thank you again for taking the time to join us and for your participation. I hope you all have a wonderful day and a safe and joyous weekend. Thanks.